company is trying to onboard different forms of GenAI tools. We are from Symmetry Systems, and we work with several companies all the way from this commercial manufacturing tech to also just defense companies. So really high assurance environments is one of the key filters. It's actually really helpful to just get a sense of when we think of an organization, what a median organization looks like from the lens of someone who is trying to onboard machine learning tools, AI tools. This is essentially a snapshot of a corporate environment for roughly a median company. It's something where you have 200,000 plus identities. This could be human identities, could be service roles, machine identities. And then it starts sort of walking, like on the one side you have identities, on the other side you have data. So data could be things that are in the corporate environment, which is SharePoint, OneDrive, and equivalent. Things that could be in product environments. So you think of unstructured buckets, RDS, DynamoDB, things like this. And then the CISO kind of thinks of product, and then data lakes and analysts who are working with Snowflake, Databricks, all of these different type of tools. And there are about thousands of those. Now, a regular CISO may have, let's say, tens of people working for them. Of course, this variance is big, but proportionately, if you have tens of security engineers, you have thousands, hundreds to thousands of applications or developers working around. So this is just roughly the size of an organization. It's also helpful to see what this organization looks physically. So this is the graph of all the data stores, data and identities. So the legend really is blue is data, everything non-blue are human identities, service roles, etc. And the edges in this graph are either permissions from identities to data, or they are operations, so you can filter this by either. And the key takeaways here are, you can see that there are several islands of data that are formed with the heart of the central nodes that are different types of identities in the middle. Those are BUs that have done a pretty good job of constructing a moat and a drawbridge around their environment. Things are pretty controlled, governed, and so on. But the other thing that's really hard to miss is that there's a giant mosh pit in the middle of all these permissions that are just completely unused, that are probably unnecessary, and they're also ungoverned. So it's this environment that a CISO is sitting around thinking, all right, I'm going to enable my corp, dev, and data lake teams to run generative AI tools. Now, the story that they are told, and probably the reasonable future state once we resolve the mosh pit, is that it's going to be great. Security is straightforward because, hey, look, we are not going to train. Like if I'm a provider of such models, Microsoft is just an example. Like we'll not train our foundation models on your data. You get a single tenant environment. That's a pretty big use case for our argument for security. And then like, hey, this is not fine tuning. I'm just using RAG. This is just indexing your policies and then going off of that. So that's also secure, right? So if I'm kind of using Microsoft terminology, you say like, hey, there's a really nice new identity store service called an Entra ID. There's a data governance service called Purview. You take data and identities together, and then these drive policies through data stores like OneDrive, SharePoint, etc., and tools like Copilot. That's the vision. Like, hey, if we get this, we get a really nice, rosy future. And from a CISO's point of view, the things to worry about are where you're looking outside. Like, hey, you might have employees who might write super duper top secret stuff out to ChatGPT. So we've been doing so-called CASB tools, DLP type tools before. Let's put a filter on this text box that goes out to ChatGPT and see if people are writing secrets. That's fair. Another set of really deep scientific work that's going on, and one of the authors is right here, is around, hey, how do you build really great robust models? You can poison these models. You can figure out how to get them to do bad things. So these are pretty great. But from, again, the three environments that we said, this really affects the development environment when you're introducing, as a developer, a model into your product. But the rest of the environments, really, this doesn't affect. The rest of the environment, what it looks like, is something like this. And this is drawn from several really large organizations to smaller ones, where all of these have happened in practice, despite all the controls that are placed around Microsoft Copilot, where the recommended model is like, hey, you just onboard 50 people or 100 people to start. And when you start from there, folks can start querying, asking Copilot's indexing everything in the background. And the final findings were I could figure out, or employees could figure out what the salaries are for different BUs that they should have no access to. They could figure out what the RIF plans are and why specific people, internal discussions on why they're getting RIF. Internal information like financial sales projections, business IP, CAD files, roadmaps for, hey, if I'm making Baby Yoda movie next year, all that stuff is right there, right? And then the classic things like customer data gets leaked pretty massively as well. So this is very, very, very common. Like this is blocking Copilot adoption in many places because they're like, hey, we can't confidently roll out Copilot into the mosh pit. And really the root cause for this is this diagram from the Copilot architecture websites, right? So you see that big icon in the middle, it gets the query, then it just builds the graph index of all the content. It uses that to pull out, and all the permissions on the graph that's being built, on the database that's built, is the permissions that are inherited from SharePoint. So from everyone that folks who already know how SharePoint works, there's org-wide permissions, there's public permissions, and then there are just groups that you make that you basically, as people join, move, and leave, you only monotonically add permissions over time. You never really give them up. So I think that's the root cause. And then and just a quick shout out to my colleague, Claude Mandy, who's presenting the State of Cloud Data Security tomorrow at a workshop. He's there in the audience, where he's showing that across several range of customers, if you let some indexing tool like Copilot run on a data store or an environment that 10% of the environments across immediate environments across our customers have like massively sensitive data. This is not just PII, but all the different types we talked about before. So this is the underlying root cause. So now the question is, what are we going to do about this? So it's kind of changing the tone a little bit from doom and gloom to, hey, look, what really could be a path out? There's a really classic field of information flow control, and the notion of we're trying to really, what the guarantees that we want are not what we are expressing on Entra ID and Purview. What we don't want are just asset permissions of I belong to a group and the group has access to folders. What I really want to be able to do are map out data types, map out identity types. So identity types could be contractors, could be vendors, could be different ranges of contractors and so on. And then the most kind of important and hardest part that probably gets the least attention so far is the notion of like, what are you doing with it, right? So the classic triad is like, hey, what data do I have? Who can access it? And how is it used? So the how is it used part comes with a lot of like the baseline use cases, clear and present use cases today have to do, for example, with data residency. Like, hey, citizens of Indonesia, their data should not flow out of Jakarta, etc. Now, how do we work this into practice? This is a super, super old field. Dorothy Denning started this, I guess, in way back. There's been folks who've done it at the OS level, PL level, distributed systems. The decentralized work by Andrew Myers and Lisco is super, super relevant because there are only like 10, 20, tens of security and compliance people. The context, the business context for compliance, for what the data could be, is basically in the hands of the business units themselves. So the fundamental model has to be fully decentralized versus the dominant model today where GRC teams are the ones that are defining policies for the entire org. That is just not going to scale at the ones that we are talking about. And then this, one of my favorite little pointers is Max Kron at MIT worked on Flume. Flume was deployed with OkCupid. So if you were using OkCupid 10 years ago, you were using cutting edge information flow tech to date. But then since then, this work has been pulled along, and right now there's probably over $1 billion going into this field over the last couple of years alone. Very exciting stuff. So what are some 3 key directions in this field that we can really pull together and work on? One of them is, if you look at HIPAA certifications, I just pointed out one of the papers that's relevant here. All these standards really talk about, you have to formally define the notion of customer data. But really, this is a probabilistic definition. It's not just PII as an email. All emails are not PII. Emails with different things, but also not belonging to my same company. What's the confidence interval do I have that this particular data set is clinical trials, genomic data, and so on? So there's a definition of customer information that needs to be happening. There's a definition of, okay, who's a business partner, what type of business partners. So there's a huge opportunity in taking kind of plain English natural language statements or half legalese type of statements and turning them into an intermediate representation that is much more formal and verifiable and has much neater properties. And you could build separate LLMs that are checker LLMs compared to the ones that are actually doing the translation. And that could be huge because one example on the bottom right over there is just regular propositional calculus, but there's work around more full-featured languages like AWS has started Cedar as a programming language. For authorization, we should extend that into information flow control languages. So that would be pretty cool area to work on. This is under how do you specify the policies. Another one is once you are specifying the policies, your organization has to respond to the space. So whenever we talk about identity and access management, IAM in textbooks and manuals, the pictures look like what you see on the top right, which is like, hey, there's a user, there's a group, there's a role, there's a graph, and it looks pretty straightforward. It's almost like, what problem is even here? In practice, that mosh pit that I showed you before, if I lay it out on there, that's what it looks like. A user gets access to a role, through which you get access to a group, through which you get access to more users, and you keep circling back, and it gets really hard to even figure out, how do I start refactoring that graph? Because you can't boil the ocean all at once. You can't reconstruct from scratch. You have to incrementally move this to a different, better spot. So Mikhail, who is here in the audience, or at least here in the venue, he's been working on how do you incrementally repair these IAM graphs. And the key insight here, one of the findings was, in graphs, IAM graphs as they exist today, you only need to be able to compromise 3 to 5 carefully chosen identity types to be able to compromise the entire network, or 60 to 80% of the network. It almost means that like on the cloud, you're driving super close to the edge of compromise as things stand today. And things like cap group, whatever, should not be a surprise. Another direction that aligns really well, this is where Leo and we've been interfacing for the last several years, is it's not just natural language, but there's a visual interpretation of what your environment looks like. So this is from a customer environment where you can see they started off in the same graph on the top left in January, and just by the security team showcasing the problems to the different BUs, the BUs self-corrected their own permissions and entitlements. Now you're actually adding some, not even teeth, but just visibility into access entitlements cleanup. And over the year, you can see that you ended up with a much cleaner pond, whereas or lake, when you started off with a really messy, cobwebbed, like unused permissions lake in January. And you don't need to be an IAM expert to know that thing in December is much better and cleaner than the one in January. There's another problem that I think is super compelling. One is when you have an environment, so one of the big problems is, hey, I have to deploy a ton of service roles belonging to vendors in my cloud environment. They have partial visibility into my environment. And how do you certify third-party risk? Like, what's the attack surface? So the problem is really of like, given some partial information about the graph, how would you run MITRE ATT&CK style, like multi-stage processes? And you only get a few shots at measuring the environment because you don't want to be too loud, or sometimes these APIs themselves are very rate limited. So how do you use machine learning or reinforcement learning? So there's some papers references here to figure out how to escalate your privileges, even if you start off with a ostensibly lower privilege role. So these are 3 really interesting directions to work on. And the key kind of takeaway that I want to leave you with is, on the left is the recommended Microsoft direction for how you should onboard Copilot safely. There's this beautiful Gantt chart waterfall diagram of discover and identify sensitive business data. This is step 1. If you have 30,000 buckets and 900 petabytes, your step 1 is just never going to end, right? So instead, this model of onboard slowly and do a bunch of hard things perfectly, what we propose is you have to think of these as, these are 3 concurrent axes that you have to spiral out on, right? As opposed to solve one thing at a time and then move on. So really, it makes no sense to say, scan every byte and figure out what I have, and I have my data inventory, then I will do the next step and so on. You have to almost probabilistically scan the content, permissions, and how it's used all together to improve risk starting quickly. So I'll pit stop here to say that our whole vision really here is that you want to have a domain-specific stack where people who understand the business context most they have a natural interface that goes to an IR, goes to a synthesis tool that just generates it out for different data stores. And if we do this, hopefully the mosh pit, and on the right is a different customer environment that's done a really great job of incrementally fixing their environment. So you can see there are really nice clusters of environments with drawbridges going out of data flows. I will hit start.
Yeah, we have time for one or two questions.
Yes, please.
So this is great if you can get the data of what you have, how things are connected, but like most places they won't even have well, not most places, but a lot of places don't have that data, and it's really hard for them to collect it. So
That's
how do you deal with that?
So it's easier to do this on the cloud, because on the cloud you have all these data stores with varying levels of difficulty. The biggest thing here is there are some data stores on each cloud. So S3 on Amazon, BigQuery on Google, and blob stores, etc. on Azure, where A, you can start quickly, you can get org-wide permissions, and B, you can show value. Once you've seen value, and these act as sort of like the messaging buses, kind of like, kind of watering holes for different transactional data stores. Once you've seen value, now there's a lot more momentum to be like, hey, let me go wire up the RDS environment and the Dynamo and different BUs, etc. So momentum is the answer, really. Thank you so much.